Our text for today is from Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Hear the word of the Lord. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. My name's Taylor. I'm one of the pastors here at High Rock. Today we're kicking off a brand new sermon series called Practicing the Way, and our lead-off practice is Sabbath. Now, Sabbath, as we're going to learn more about today, is what Scripture defines as a 24-hour period, once a week, of rest, delight, and worship. It's the fourth of the Ten Commandments, and as we're going to learn today, it comes up a lot in the Bible. And we're going to get into all of that, though. But before we do that, right off the bat, I've just got to acknowledge this. I stink at Sabbathing. That's not false modesty. I really mean that. I was raised to work hard and to value others over yourself, even to a fault. Maybe even especially to a fault. My mother was a nurse who worked long, hard hours, often pulling graveyard shifts. My father's a pastor who works incredibly hard. Almost my entire family, and this is true going back generations, work in helping professions. You've probably heard me say this before, but I'm at least fifth generation clergy. It probably goes back further than that, but that's just as far as our records go. So I've inherited a lot of spoken and unspoken values about working hard and serving others. Now, it's not that anyone ever explicitly said, don't Sabbath, or taking a 24-hour period to rest, delight, and worship is wrong, but I also never really saw that as part of our family values or rhythms either. And I did grow up in the church. Then I went to seminary, and I learned all about what the Bible says about the Sabbath. I was blown away. It was like there was this massive part of my faith, a faith that I'd been practicing for over 2 decades at that point, and I'd completely missed it. I was floored. Except, and this drove me absolutely crazy. In seminary, we'd often be forced to go on mandatory retreats on Saturdays, where we'd listen to lectures on Sabbath and self-care. All the while, our reading and writing assignments were piling up, and the faculty was taking an extra day out of our schedule when we'd normally get to do our work or rest. The retreats made it harder to actually have time to Sabbath. We were in class Monday through Friday, and most of us had responsibilities in churches on Sunday. Saturday was precious time. Now, I'm not one to keep my opinions to myself. And I will say, I may have developed a bit of a reputation for being pretty snarky on these retreats. You know that look someone gets on their face when you're about to say something that they already know you're going to say and they really don't want to hear it again? Yeah, I got really familiar with that look. I knew I needed to Sabbath. If they would just let me free to determine my own schedule, I would actually do what they were telling me to do. Which is why it's so embarrassing for me to tell you what I'm about to tell you next. When I finished seminary and started out in ministry, I promptly forgot everything I'd learned about Sabbathing. For the first year, I worked 7 days a week. I took no Sabbath days. The church was struggling, and what I'll call my responsibility gene took over. I was new in ministry, and I desperately wanted to prove myself. At 25, I was leading a church, and I was the youngest adult in the church. I was so fearful that I didn't actually have what it took, that if I didn't put in the extra effort for the sermon every week, people would leave, or they wouldn't respect me as a pastor or as a leader. The church wasn't exactly flush with cash either, and so I worried that if I didn't work hard, really hard, to make the church grow, that it would close. So I worked really hard. Mostly, I was just terrified that if I didn't exhaust every possible ounce of my own strength and effort, that it was going to fall apart the second I took a break. Sabbath didn't really sound like a welcome relief. It felt like a threat. It got so bad, and I was so exhausted that my physician prescribed me steroids for exhaustion. And my church board staged an intervention and quite literally forced me to take a day off each week. Now, I know that in our high-achieving culture, which prizes hard work, that can come off like a humble brag. And in my experience in American churches, failing to take a Sabbath in the church, that's the only sinful activity a pastor can get up in front of the church on Sunday and literally brag about, and people will applaud for it. If I got up here and said, hey, I cheated on my taxes, or I had an affair, or I robbed a bank, no one would suspect that I'm really secretly bragging. But that's not just true for pastors. I bet we've all heard humble brags about working hard before. In fact, we've probably used a few ourselves. They're like, I'm a little bit tired this morning. Oh yeah? Well, I only got 4 hours of sleep this whole week. Or someone says, like, work's been crazy. It's, oh, I know, tell me about it. My boss has me working on this big project. I've been so busy, I can barely think straight. I haven't taken a day off in a month. Why is it that we Christians get the Sabbath so backwards? Where we say we believe in the Bible and we take its teachings and its commands seriously. I mean, Sabbath isn't on the list of 10 suggestions. It's literally in the 10 commandments. Now, I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And while there's probably more than I'll share here, I do want to share what I believe are the top 3 reasons we get Sabbath so wrong in the church. The first is that I believe that we fundamentally misunderstand Jesus' teachings on the subject. There are numerous occasions in the Gospels where the thing that seems to annoy the Pharisees most is what Jesus does on the Sabbath day. And it feels like he's constantly flouting the rules. There's the story in Mark where Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field on the Sabbath and picking grain to eat, and the Pharisees, well, they get upset about that. Then there's a story in Matthew where Jesus heals a man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath. That really sets them off. And given that we as Christians don't observe many parts of the Mosaic Law, we eat shellfish and pork, we don't require certain clothing, it's easy to see how Jesus responded to the Sabbath rules of his day and come to the conclusion that this is just another one of those parts of the law that came to fulfillment in Jesus that no longer applies to those of us who live by the Spirit, who are not under the law. The thing is, though, Jesus wasn't rejecting the concept or the commandment of Sabbath itself. He was rejecting the Pharisees' rigid legalistic interpretation of the Sabbath. He was provoking them to demonstrate the holes in their logic, to show how they had entirely missed the spirit of the practice. And they'd created a suffocating web of rules around it that had taken the very thing that was created for liberation and rest from burdens into a burden itself. As Jesus says in Mark, the Sabbath was created for humans. Humans weren't created for the Sabbath. Now, the second reason I believe that we get the Sabbath so profoundly wrong in the church, and this is a bold claim, is that I believe that it is one of the most countercultural claims of the entire gospel. And so we're eager to explain it away and find ways to say that doesn't really apply to us. Yes, there are other areas of the gospel or the Christian life that are countercultural. The Christian sexual ethic isn't exactly popular. Loving enemies sounds great on paper. It's a tough sell, though, when it really counts. Living generously, we tend to prefer when that's other people who do it and not us. But taking a 24-hour period out of our week to partake in rest, delight, and worship, that's a tough sell. People are busy. Life is full. And in our culture, we prize hard work and grit. Many of us are trying desperately to get ahead, to hold on to any edge to stay ahead of the pack, or maybe just desperately trying to keep up because it feels like we're behind. Rest? Stop working? Are you kidding me? In America, which is deeply shaped by the Protestant culture of work, the Protestant work ethic culture, rest can be seen as synonymous with laziness. There's this meme that floats around the internet from time to time comparing French and American out-of-office email responses. The French one goes like this: I'm out of the office for 2 months of vacation. Email me again when I get back. The American one goes, I'm out of the office for 2 hours for open heart surgery, but you can reach me on my cell anytime. I used to not believe that the Protestant work ethic was a thing because I grew up Protestant and I never heard anyone talk about it, and I didn't see anything in particular in the scriptures that seemed to justify the concept. That was until I read an economic study out of the University of Chicago, which was conducted in Germany, where postal codes are highly segregated across Protestant and Catholic lines. So even to this day, in an extremely post-Christian Germany, postal codes that were formerly Protestant show noticeable economic differences. People there work more hours, make more money, are more likely to be self-employed. Culture is powerful. And in America, which is a country deeply shaped by Protestant values and culture, this reality is woven into the fabric of our society. We use phrases like on my grind set or hustling or pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. We say things like, I'll rest when I'm dead, or burning the midnight oil, nose to the grindstone, time is money. I hear it when I talk to High Rockers. Your schedules are so full. We literally have a church workshop for families about how to navigate your schedules. The economic and social pressures we feel to keep up with everyone else can make it feel impossible, almost threatening, to talk about taking a Sabbath. Who's got time for that? 24 hours every week? Give me a break. Some of us would be lucky to get 24 minutes. If we had a full day every week, we'd take an extra class, take on a new project at work, rest. Nice try. You know, a few years ago, this is right after we moved here, I was talking with my doctor, and he was asking me about how I was adjusting to life in the Boston area. And he said, you know, in some places people want to get rich, in other places people want to change history, and others people want to win a Nobel Prize. In Boston, people want all three. Our world, it's not set up to make Sabbath easy, which means that even if we do take this command seriously and we want to live into it, the world around us makes trying to live into it as an individual and to resist the cultural pressure of constant work, constant availability, constant striving, makes it extremely challenging. So this is why I believe that Sabbath is one of the most countercultural practices of the Christian faith. You know, the world feels so deeply chaotic and uncertain, and one of the very few things we can try to do to keep our heads above water, one of the very few variables we can actually do something about, it's to work harder than the person next to us. In this area where the world's brightest minds come to work and research, sometimes the only way to even try to stay in the conversation, it's to work harder than the person next to you. Now, the third reason that I believe we struggle with this so much is because of the cultural pressures around time and work, is that the thing that we tend to value the most in our lives, it's our time. We'd often prefer to write a check rather than to give an hour of our time. And the foundation beneath all of this, it's always the same thing. Whether we're afraid we won't have enough money so we can't stop working, or we're worried that we just don't have enough time and so we can't rest because we've got so much to do, or we're concerned that if we do rest, we're going to look lazy, or whatever it is that keeps you from taking a Sabbath, the foundational issue, it's always some version of the fear of not having enough or the fear of not being enough. We see this dynamic play itself out time and time again in the scriptures as well. When God gives Moses the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, we're given a really important context clue. The Israelites had just spent the last 400 years in slavery in Egypt. Slaves don't get days off. A slave's value is directly measured by how much they produce. Being productive in that context, it wasn't just about flourishing, it was about survival. If you stop being useful, you stop meriting food, housing, or medical care. Why would a slave owner spend resources on a slave who's not contributing? You know, earlier in Exodus, this period is said to have spanned 4 generations, meaning that this way of life was passed down in families. And so now, as liberated free people, no longer in bondage or slavery, they have a new opportunity. But it's also a new challenge. If you've ever tried to correct a bad habit that your parents taught you, that their parents taught them, you know how hard it is to escape the gravitational pull of brokenness that is generationally baked into family systems. And in this case, for the Israelites, we're not simply talking about generational bad habits, we're talking about generational trauma. It takes more than simply knowing about a pattern to change it. It takes a lot of effort and intentionality. which is why God commands that everyone does this. God doesn't leave it up to single individuals, but commands it to be a communal way of life for them to do together in community. Breaking out of that scarcity mindset, that narrative that if they stop to rest, that it would be fatal, that's easier said than done. We see it when God is providing manna in the wilderness. God says, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they are to bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Initially, the people failed that test. They gathered more than they were supposed to, and the bread rotted. Also notice that in this section of Exodus, which comes before the Ten Commandments where the Sabbath is required, do you notice how God is already preparing them for the Sabbath by giving them twice as much on the sixth day so that they don't have to work on the seventh day? Now, even after the Israelites come out of the wilderness and become established as a nation, keeping the Sabbath becomes difficult. Every single time the Israelites got themselves into some version of trouble, it was always the same foundational dynamic. It's the fear of not having enough, of not being enough on their own. And it's true. Well, it's half true. Israel on its own was a small nation. Though throughout most of its history, its neighbors were far more powerful than them on paper, but instead of trusting God to provide, to protect, and to lead, they relied on their own two hands. They tried to become like the other nations rather than set apart, unique in their devotion and reliance on God. So on their own, they aren't enough. But they were never on their own. God promised to be with them if only they had trusted that. We see it in the scarcity mindset with the manna. We see it over the centuries that came afterwards as well. God commands that every seventh year, the land itself is to have a Sabbath where nothing new is to be planted and nothing should be harvested. The land was a gift from God, and part of receiving that good gift was trusting that the God who originally gave it would continue to be faithful. It wasn't a once and done sort of thing. Except the Israelites didn't trust that God would continue to provide. And so for 490 years, they failed to let the land rest in the seventh year. And failing to let the land rest becomes one of the central issues of which God's prophets prophesy against year after year after year. And so eventually, when God gives the Israelites up to the consequence of their sin and they're led into exile in Babylon, it's through the prophet Jeremiah, God tells them that they will remain in exile for 70 years to allow the land to make up for all that it was denied. So by the time Jesus is teaching and ministering, because failing to abide by the Sabbath had become the central issue, the Pharisees had become obsessed with making sure that everyone followed the Sabbath to a T. In fact, just to be absolutely sure that this problem never happened again, they made extra rules so that no one even got close to violating the commandment from God. They were not taking any chances. Except the problem is that failing to observe the Sabbath actually isn't the central issue. Failing to trust God is the central issue. And failing to observe the Sabbath is simply the symptom. And it shows up through overwork and scarcity behavior, which can look like workaholism, hoarding, or it can even look like tribalism. All of those symptoms have the same root cause, which is an unwillingness to trust God for provision. So we take matters into our own hands. We store up more than we need. We work more than we need to or than is healthy. We create tribes to create us, to protect ourselves from whatever them is. All of it, literally all of it, finds its foundational root in not trusting God. In the creation narrative in Genesis, we learn that all human beings are created in the image of God. And in that same narrative, we see that as the conclusion of creation itself, God rests on the seventh day. If even God rests and we're created in the image of God, then there is something essential to both our humanity and our relationship with God that cannot be understood apart from the practice of Sabbath. Biblical scholars note that the placement of the Sabbath as the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments isn't accidental. That the first three are about our relationship with God, and the Sabbath command stands as a bridge to the last seven, which teach us how to relate to one another. I don't think it's too much to say that Sabbath is a foundational part of what it means to be created as human beings in God's own image. To Sabbath is to understand our very humanity, and it's the thing that helps us to see the image of God in others. Jesus tells us, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I also really like the way that Eugene Peterson paraphrases it in The Message. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. I'll be real honest with you. When I was working myself into the ground back in that first year of pastoral ministry, I didn't believe this. Now, you never would have caught me admitting that, but my life clearly demonstrated that I didn't believe that this was true. I figured this was sort of a nice idea, but not really practical. Sort of how most of us explain away Jesus' other hard teachings too, like turning the other cheek or loving our enemies. It's sort of like pirate code, right? More of a suggestion than a rule. It's a nice idea, but I've got work to do, and lots of it. When I was forced into taking a day off every week by my church board, I didn't accept it particularly joyfully. I did it dutifully. It wasn't until I heard another pastor say something that absolutely rocked my world. They said, "The work of God cannot damage the image of God in you." The work of God cannot damage the image of God in you. I had allowed myself to believe that because I was sacrificing for the church, because the church is part of the kingdom of God, that endless hard work couldn't be a bad thing. I'd rest when I got to heaven. And at the rate I was working myself into a puddle, it wasn't going to be long until I got there. When you're 25 years old, otherwise healthy, and a physician prescribes you steroids simply to get through what has become a normal day, that's a problem. An easy yoke following Jesus was grinding me into the dust. The work of God cannot damage the image of God in you. On the outside, my overwork, my failure to Sabbath could mask the reality that I wasn't truly trusting God. It looked kind of holy. But at the foundation, it wasn't just my love of God that was motivating me. It was also my fear of failure, my worry about not being enough. It looked just righteous enough to pass muster with a quick glance, but eventually it fell apart. The fruit of my patterns told the real truth, the whole truth. I'd really love to be able to tell you that after coming to this realization that knowledge alone gave me the strength and motivation to fix this immediately. Truth is, I still struggle with this. I've made progress, I have, but I'm also not where I want to be either. I still find myself in times falling into old, unhealthy patterns in seasons of high stress, allowing myself to believe those half-truths that because my work is for God, I can fudge the numbers a bit on Sabbath. But when I do this, when I take a 24-hour period of rest, delight, and worship, it is powerful. It really is amazing to see what a full day of being intentional about not working, thoughtfully making space for delight and joy, reading the Bible, praying, what it does for me. The tragic irony of not doing this in stressful seasons is that by doing this, those seasons would actually be less stressful. We can trick ourselves and say that life is so full, we can't afford to Sabbath. The truth is, when life is stressful, we can't afford not to. When life is so busy that adding Sabbath feels like it's going to break you, that's something to pay attention to. Because a busy life and a full life are not the same thing. The enemy would like nothing more than for you to be so busy that you don't take intentional space to reflect on your life rhythms and how you're either pointing yourself towards God or away from trusting God. Sabbath, it's not one more thing. It's the thing that puts all the other things in our lives in their rightful place. Sabbath is a practice which helps us to remember why we're here and who it is that ultimately sustains us, holds us, provides for us, created us, and loves us. So, what about you? Is there a half-truth that you tell yourself which allows you to brush off Sabbath? Are you working hard to feed your family except you left need territory long ago and now it's really more than just about wanting more? Is there maybe a narrative that you inherited from your family like I inherited from mine and the Israelites inherited from theirs that it's keeping you from Sabbathing, from taking a 24-hour period of rest, delight, and worship every week? For these 8 weeks, we're talking about practicing the way. So I'm curious, what would it look like to take Sabbath seriously for 8 weeks? Or maybe if that feels like too much, what about starting with just 1 week, seeing how that goes? Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Progress is good. Where we start doesn't really matter all that much. But where we're heading, well, that matters a great deal. So, is there one step towards Sabbath that you can make today? Theory will only take us so far. Practice is what reshapes our lives in the way of Jesus. And it's the practice of Sabbath which helps us to let go of the half-truths and the lies which tell us that we aren't enough. It's the rhythm of rest, delight, and worship that reminds us that we are enough when we place our trust in God, who is more than enough. My hope for us as a church is that throughout this 8-week series, through the sermons, community groups, and small groups, we will all begin to find Jesus' words ring true in our lives. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. May we heed those words and believe and experience the power of their truth. May we rest in the embrace of our loving God, who created us and calls us to radically place our trust in him. Amen.